and welcome to Daily Debrief from People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya. First up, February marks 61 years of the United States economic blockade of Cuba. We discuss how this policy has hurt Cuba and the world. US sanctions cast a long shadow as Syrians bear the brunt of it after widespread destruction from recent earthquakes. And in the United Kingdom, the Premier League has charged Manchester City Football Club with breaches of its financial rules once again. A policy that has hurt Cubans for 61 years, the US blockade of trade with Cuba continues, despite a UN vote overwhelmingly in favor of ending the embargo and solidarity for Cuba from countries around the world. The United States has refused to change. How has Cuba coped? What does this blockade mean to Cubans, and why the world should care about ending this regime? Zoe from People's Dispatch joins us with some details. Hi, Zoe. Welcome again. Good to have you back on Debrief. So, Zoe, 61 years of the blockade now. And I was reading somewhere where they said that it's petty. What America is doing to Cuba is actually petty. Would you agree with this characterization, and why?
Well, I think beyond that, it's a criminal blockade. It's a genocidal blockade that's cost Cuba billions of dollars. So many people's lives have been lost because of this embargo, which effectively strangles the Cuban economy, prevents them from engaging in regular trade with the nations of the world. It's a criminal blockade. The U.S. has no grounds on which to impose this blockade, and it's not only about U.S. relations with Cuba, but about global relations with Cuba. There's so many different beyond the initial embargo, which was imposed, as you said, 61 years ago. The U.S. has increased and continued to impose more and more measures against the island to further restrict their already restricted ability to engage in financial transactions, for companies to do business in Cuba. For example, there's Cuba's listed on the state sponsors of terrorism list, which also severely limits their ability to have normal economic and trade relations. And at the end of the day, what is the reason for this? It's because Cuba is considered a threat to U.S. hegemony, to U.S. ideological hegemony, because of its resistance to U.S. imperialism. So there's no reason why any nation should be put under sanctions. There's no the sanctions themselves are affecting above all the people in the countries, limiting their access to food, their access to medicine, and their quality of life.
Right, Zoe. Zoe, what are the odds that actually this sanctions regime would actually, we're seeing as unfolding in Syria, that you're denying people access to basic necessities even during a crisis because of the sanctions. So what is the effect that this has on people?
Well, it means that, as I said, getting life-saving medicine, getting life-saving technical parts, for example, Cuba's medical industry. Today, for medical procedures, you need so many different high-tech machines, processors, and Cuba's unable to buy these parts. They're unable to repair these parts when they get broken. So this affects so many levels of life. It's almost hard to comprehend. Even calculating the impact of sanctions is impossible, because it's not only one thing, but it has cascading effects in society. Just looking at health, as I mentioned, those impacts, but also Cuba's ability to import food. When people can't do business there, of course, this impacts their ability to generate national revenue. This impacts their budget. We saw this past year, with the devastating fire that happened at their oil tanker facility. Right. This is a country that's already strangleholded. And of course, this fire was provoked by lightning strike. But the fact that Cuba hasn't been able to update, for example, so much of their infrastructure is also because of the blockade. So there's so many different impacts and manifestations. And, across the world, people have been engaged in long campaigns calling for the lifting of the embargo, calling for the lifting of these sanctions, the blockade, however you want to frame it, because the people of the world are also impacted by this. Cuba's scientific and medical advances are help to humanity. The development of vaccines, the development of different life-saving treatments for cancer and for other diseases. And also the people of the world are denied access to this information and medicine because of the blockade. So there's so many, we could talk for hours about how both the Cuban people and the people of the world are impacted by this. And that's why so many people across the world use every opportunity to denounce the impacts of the embargo, to denounce this criminal policy against the people of Cuba.
Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
By now, virtually the entire world has seen images and footage from the earthquake that has devastated large parts of Syria. Buildings in the conflict-torn country, weakened by years of conflict and the inability of the impoverished state to offer repairs, are collapsing in large numbers. Is the world paying attention to the severe crisis, which has a human and economic toll that will probably take years to mend? Abdul from People's Dispatch joins us to discuss the situation. Abdul, thanks a lot for joining us. Abdul, the reports from Syria, the reports from Turkey, widespread devastation caused by the earthquake. And, in particular, there are these videos we're seeing on the channels and we're seeing them on social media of buildings in Syria in particular collapsing days after the quake. Can you just sort of bring us up to speed on what is the situation so far?
Well, the situation is really getting worse, primarily because the buildings collapse, as you were rightly pointing out, because most of the buildings in Syria in particular are weakened because of the decade-long war. As we all know, that because of the war, there is no repair work, and the bombings throughout those decades of bombing has basically weakened the foundation of a large number of buildings. The buildings have also collapsed in Turkey, primarily because of the bad weather and the earthquake really being quite strong. 7.8 magnitude earthquake is really strong, and even the aftershocks have been quite strong. So that has basically, particularly the older buildings, the reason in which a large number of Syrian refugees are staying. Yes. The border areas with Syria, between Syria and Turkey, and particularly the fact that, as I said before, because it is the region which has been going through a war, and that war which has seen a lot of bombing, a lot of non-repair work, non-repair of the buildings. So all those things have kind of created a situation where a large number of buildings are feeling the effect of even the minor aftershocks and collapsing under the shock. And that has basically that we should also remember that this is the reason which is really highly densely populated, primarily because this is some of them are rebel-held areas where a large number of refugees from different parts of Syria have gathered and they're staying. So more than 3 times of the actual population of the city, for example, in Idlib and in Aleppo, people are staying in those buildings. So of course, the number of casualties is going to be heavier in the coming days, primarily because of the high density and weak buildings.
Right, Abdul, very often we've discussed on Daily Debrief, the conditions in Syria, extremely severe. There's malnutrition, there's lack of medical services, even in normal times, so-called normal times. So now, can you also talk about what is the need of the people immediately, and whether there is a likelihood of the, what we call the international community actually rallying behind people in Syria and Turkey?
Well, the support of the international community is very crucial, primarily because the state in Syria is not in a condition to kind of provide the basic rescue and relief work because of the war, as I mentioned before, which has kind of completely eradicated the Syrian state's capacity to carry out such a large-scale relief and rescue work. But the fact that the Syria is under sanctions does not help. The US and its allies have imposed a lot many sanctions on Syria, and those sanctions basically prevent all kind of rescue and relief work from the international community in particular. So yesterday, Syrian Red Cross Crescent Society's head did a press conference and asked the international community to kind of at least give some kind of some kind of relief from the sanctions for the period, for the immediate period, so that the relief and rescue work can continue. But so far, we have not seen any word of commitment coming from the US or its allies. In fact, the US and its allies have only expressed concerns and support to the rebel-backed groups in the region, which control a small part of Syria. The impact is larger, and mostly the government-controlled areas are also affected. So instead of there is a clear-cut discrimination going on, and the NGOs which are selected to be supported by international communities have a very limited scope. They operate in a very limited area that leaves the large part of Syria unattended. And that is one thing which has basically exposed the sanctions like never before, the impact of sanctions. Though different international organizations, including the UN, have pointed out earlier that the sanctions are basically have been hampering the recovery process in Syria, affecting millions of Syrians' life. Now the earthquake has created further need that those sanctions are removed and more international aid can flow in, and more international machinery, relief mechanism, expertise, rescue work can reach those parts of Syria which are affected by the earthquake, and that can only happen if the sanctions are removed.
Right, Abdul, and thanks a lot for joining us. An independent commission in the United Kingdom will go over a report prepared by the Premier League. The report charges Manchester City Football Club with 101 breaches of its rules. This is not the first time Manchester has faced an investigation. This one lasted 4 years, and it deals with the club's activities from 2009 to 2018. Sports journalist Siddhant Ane spoke with us a short while back. Siddhant, good to have you back on the show. Siddhant, 100 financial irregularities, a 4-day investigation. Can you just bring us up to speed on what's happened so far?
Yeah, so this is not the first time Manchester City has faced an investigation into breaches of various kinds of competition rules. UEFA had conducted an investigation which eventually ended up at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is based in Switzerland, and is like kind of the apex court that looks at final decisions when it comes to sporting matters. What happened there was, by a 2-1 verdict, essentially the court said that some of the allegations made against Manchester City were time barred, and others there wasn't enough evidence to prove. So it wasn't a case of saying that there was no case to be made, just that UEFA's lawyers didn't do a good enough job of making that case. Now it's come to the Premier League, which is the English domestic competition and one of the biggest football leagues in the world. They have conducted a long-running investigation. At the point when sort of this Court of Arbitration for Sport decision happened, many of us assumed that, okay, this is another one of those big money things that just gets swept under the carpet. But clearly that hasn't been the case, because where there's money involved for Manchester City, there's also money involved for everyone else in the Premier League sort of scenario. I think this is where it becomes a little murky, at least in terms of the politics or the background of it, because it also has to do with the Super League and basically what big clubs are doing the world over. It brings into question things like when nation states come in and own football clubs, what all they can do then in that position. In this case, Abu Dhabi owns Manchester City, and we've not heard anything from the host of sponsors, whether it's Etihad or all of the others who are involved in this. What their response has been to the charges. Among the charges are inflating the value of these corporate relationships or sponsorships in order to basically siphon more money, bring more money in from their owners into the club, so that they could buy all of these great players and then go on to dominate the English league as they have, but also compete in the Champions League and all of that. This investigation covers a period of 13 years, Pragya. So it's an unprecedented kind of never before in the history of the Premier League or any football have these kind of charges been made and framed. Other charges relate to not fully disclosing compensation paid to former manager Roberto Mancini, as well as to the agent of a former player, Yaya Toure. And essentially not cooperating with the investigation, putting roadblocks in the way of, part of the Premier League's rules are that clubs are meant to disclose all of their financial dealings. This is in order to kind of regulate these multi-million-dollar businesses, right? We were talking a few days ago about the football money list, and Manchester City is topping that list with a revenue of over 700 million euros annually. So these are not small amounts of money. The value of their players currently is estimated at about £1 billion. So there are huge numbers at play. And what happens now is that Manchester City really have to answer to some very serious charges, Pragya.
So 13 years is the length of the investigation, and it sounds like something that will again get time barred or some such.
No, so in the Premier League rules, none of this is time barred. So actually, what happens now is a King's Council has been appointed to select a 3-member committee. That 3-member committee will include at least one financial expert. They will then look at all the charges. The Premier League has claimed that its rules have been violated. This is up on their website in great detail, and I think at some point we'll look at those rules in detail. But the penalty for violating these rules, very clearly it says, it can include, of course, docking points, other kinds of punishment, even being expelled from the competition or being relegated from the Premier League to the lower rung or the next tier of football. This is unlikely to happen, of course, and there will be a lot of back and forth before we get to any kind of conclusive stage. But over the next few months, and this committee, by the way, will also publish its report and its findings on the same Premier League website. So we will have some disclosure of the discussions that have happened. The club has responded, of course, saying there's irrefutable evidence that they have not done anything wrong. And they welcome this independent committee's evaluation of their financial dealings, and they want this matter to be closed once and for all. Now, I suppose that would be the stance, the only stance that they can take. But if you look at the totality of the violations, like you were mentioning, 101 points on which in detail the Premier League has said that its competition rules have been violated. So there will be consequences for Manchester City, and also in a wider sense, Pragya, I think it brings into question what we've talked about often on Daily Debrief and other shows, where fans are made to believe that what they are watching, what they are spending time and effort and money on is something that's real, and there is something to it. If it's found now that this over the course of these 13 years in which Manchester City have won 14 trophies domestically, so pretty much won everything. So in that course that they have essentially been cheating throughout, it kind of casts a much wider, already has, irrespective of I think what the findings might be. But if they are for some reason or somehow found guilty of what they have been charged with, I think for a lot of us football fans, it will further sort of denude the ongoings in big football and the way in which these kind of doped up with money leagues actually function.
Right, Siddhant, and thanks a lot for that update. And that is all we have for you today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow. You can visit our website for more People's Dispatch stories and watch our regular updates on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.